issues of corruption involved in preparation of our list or list of candidates and the supporting signatures. How does this affect how does this affect local democracy in Guyana when our constitution says that citizens must freely elect their local representatives? All of this fraud in the preparation of nominations for 2023 local government elections.
What is occurring in Guyana points to two fundamental issues. It points to the fundamental issue of our political culture. I cannot attest to a commitment in terms of our political actors to the rule of law and to good governance. To me, that is a fundamental problem that we are confronted with. It also points to a crisis, dysfunctionality in terms of our machinery for the conduct of elections. Unfortunately, the GCOM is constituted in a manner which allows for political actors to be commissioners, and against the background of the political culture I just referred to, seem to be unable to act as constitutional officers, and rather to act as political activists at the level of GCOM. So that what occurs is that you do not have an earnest, honest debate on issues. You basically have a situation where there seem to be a political lineup and political sides, and therefore the decisions made do not necessarily reflect what is right, what is lawful, and what is just. So I would say our country has a serious problem with democracy at large, because there are those persons who contend that democracy essentially is elections. That is not true. Democracy has more than one leg to stand on. Elections is only one. But that one itself is, in my view, does not meet the required standards because of the conduct of the institution responsible for administering elections and the conduct of the persons who occupy the institution.
General elections 2020. There were contentions that the dead voted, that persons not physically in the jurisdiction, not physically within this country's borders, were voted for. The People's Progressive Party has denied this, even in the face of evidence from the statutory bodies, particularly the Chief Immigration Officer and the Registrar of Births and Deaths. Now we have before us evidence of a person who is dead, and that person's name showing up on a list of persons who signed in support of a particular PPP candidate or list of candidates. There's a signature next to the name of this deceased person. Mr. Jagdeo, the General Secretary of the People's Progressive Party, is on record as having apologized to the children of the deceased person for her name appearing on this list and for her signature appearing on this list of supporting signatures. How do you treat with a situation like this in the face of the evidence in 2020 general elections, general regional elections, and the fact now that Jagdeo has openly admitted that his party has done something wrong to the extent that he can apologize for it?
First of all, let me add that it's not only one dead person in the particular instance which you've mentioned.
Right, but I'm zeroing in on the apology here.
It is the husband and the wife.
The husband and the wife.
Both of whom are dead. One appeared as a candidate and one appeared as a nominator with the signatures.
Well, appeared song apt.
Appeared on the document.
Appeared song apt, given the fact that these are ghosts.
They're in the document. We have sufficient evidence coming out of the 2020 recount to show that persons who were not in the country were voted for, and the persons who are deceased were voted for. The evidence is there. GCOM sought not to act on that evidence under all sorts of reasons that can't stand public scrutiny. So it goes back to my earlier question about GCOM being, I would say in that regard, a compromised body. The Attorney General, whose party contended that there was no evidence, when in fact there is evidence, and the evidence is not merely documents presented by the APNU-AFC, it is a verification of those documents, credible verification, because in the instance of the verification, there were instances when they said this was not right, and this is right.
This is by the statutory body.
The statutory body, the Chief Immigration person in charge for boards and debts, the Registrar of Boards and Debts. So the evidence is there. GCOM sat on that and said it can take no action. It's a matter for a petition. I think that is trash. Because at minimum, GCOM could have sought to review its own operations to see if there were flaws in the system that allow that to happen, and therefore to correct the system. Other than doing that, GCOM refused to review its own system. Refused to review its own system under the pretext of this is a matter for the petition. When the review is not about culpability, it's about checking your system to see if there are flaws so that the next time around you can do it better. And the Attorney General then demanded of GCOM the unverified documents, laying claim to the same fact that other persons in larger numbers had in fact been voted for. GCOM handed over those documents to the Attorney General. One would have assumed that they were being handed over so that he could have them checked and the matter determined. I think well over 6 months has elapsed, and an Attorney General who has a weekly interface through the media is patently silent on the finding in this matter.
Or whether the documents were sent for verification or not.
My information is the documents were sent.
They were sent.
That's my information. I may be wrong, but he's patently silent. And it raises lots of questions as to his earlier contention that there was no evidence, it can be proven. And now that he has the information that he can say to the public that he was correct, he's patently silent. This is the Attorney General who, when I attended consultations on RUPA, and I posed the question of how do we deal with Guyanese overseas who have evidently died. You only have to look at that announcement to see the deaths of Guyanese overseas. Our registration process was last done in 2008, and we have had no mechanism from 2008 to now. This is some 15 years to take off of the voters list persons who died overseas. When this question was posed to him, he says, well, he couldn't doubt it. He was asking me what's the solution. So obviously, there is an awareness of this, but still there's a contention that the list is not bloated, even in the face of evidence which shows that people who ought not to have been voted for were voted for. And in the potential of the Attorney General to push back on this by virtue of the information he's collected, he has not been able to push back over 4 to 6 months. So it is obvious that we have a problem, and it's obvious that there are people who are not prepared to resolve that problem, and one can only conclude that their unpreparedness has to do with the fact that they have an interest in maintaining the situation as it is. And that interest becomes manifest in the case that you have mentioned, where we see that obviously the political activists of a particular party have embraced the practice of tampering with the dead, having the dead listed for the purpose of being a candidate in this instance, for the purpose of being a nominator. And one can well imagine, with that culture exposed, that those are the same people who would have tampered with the dead for the purpose of voting, as is evident in the 2020 elections.
And who are assured of protection from the executive, I believe. Now, I want to come back to this list matter, but there's a particular issue I want to ask you to comment on. On the one hand, GCOM is saying that it does not have, and this is based on what you said moments ago, does not have a need to examine its own system to determine weaknesses and strengths and so on. It doesn't have a need to do that. But before that decision was taken not to go down the road of reviewing its own system, GCOM assumed some parliamentary power, some legislative power, by creating Order 60 without reference to the National Assembly. How do you relate these two issues?
That matter of Order 60 is now before the court. That's the pending matter before the court. So I wouldn't go deep into the matter of Order 60 because it's a matter pending before the court. But I think that the question that you raised on Order 60 may well point to the fact that GCOM acts conveniently. That there are times when, in my humble opinion, GCOM can act and it does not act. And there are other times when it ought not to act and it acts. So I think that issue fingers GCOM as not being consistent. And when one is not consistent in the context of good governance, it is the same as not being transparent. One's decisions are not predictable because you do not apply the norms as they should be applied to similar situations. You differ the norms in applying to situations. A challenge which will shortly be before GCOM in a matter of a day in relation to the way in which they have dealt with the Wakanam situation and the way in which they have dealt with other situations. You may or may not know the Wakanam situation, where GCOM approved a submission. They approved the candidates, they accepted the signatures and things like that. And lo and behold, 2 days after, a visit of a certain political official, people then went to GCOM and said, well, you know, we were forced to sign, and we really didn't sign. And the GCOM reversed its decision. GCOM had already submitted the list. Now, for me, the world is sufficiently developed for GCOM to have done some forensic work to determine whether or not those people had in fact signed. And so GCOM is challenged tomorrow for us to see if GCOM is prepared to determine the matter that can be determined, or is prepared
Logically
to
and
subject,
legally.
logically and legally, or prepared to subject itself once again
To some ridicule.
to a majority vote and the diktat, more or less, of one party.
Interesting. You know, Mr. G.H.K. Lal said on this program that the problem in this country is that we practice democracy for one day in every 5 years. And I think he was speaking to the question of elections day.
Mr. Lal
And,
is incorrect.
and that is a
Mr. Lal
tragedy.
is incorrect. I think he is honest in his view, but he's incorrect. Because the one day you're talking about is the one day when dead people vote. So I don't know if we practice democracy on that day if
Which,
dead people are allowed to vote.
which brings me to this point. The opposition parties have always contended that this list is bloated, this list is padded, this list is one that has dead people on it. This is a list that has people who are resident overseas. The local um, government elections rules require persons to be resident within a particular constituency before they can offer themselves as a candidate for that constituency or before they can vote in that constituency. Now, nominations for local government 2023 have revealed that dead people are candidates, that dead people are signing nomination forms, that persons who are resident abroad are signing nomination forms here. And we have some evidence which I'll ask the operator to put up there. And we also have discovered that when you compare people's signature with their signature on the identification card, and you relate to the fact that those persons have claimed that they did not in fact sign those forms, you know that something is wrong. And when you go the further step to have persons appearing at a police station also, which we have some pictures of, to make formal complaints that they observed that their names were placed on some lists and that signatures purporting to be theirs were affixed next to their names, but that those signatures are not theirs, and that this is a matter of forgery, this is a matter of fraud. You know that the list as it is really, really a dirty list. These revelations, would they have any impact on the forward movement of this electoral process, local government 2023, outside of whatever matter may be before the court?
Well, obviously GCOM has to look at this matter. I am not optimistic about GCOM carrying out its mandatory function because of what I started off this program by saying, that we have serious problems with the commitment to the rule of law, and the extent to which these matters will come before a commission where what determines matters is simply a vote. And there has been a trend where the vote has been to vote into being things that are unacceptable. Then there's no guarantee of the direction. You know, if I raise this matter, there's a commission who will tell me, you're trying to delay the elections. Let's get on with the business.
Sounds Rohian.
Songs, not only songs, is. That's what he would say. And clearly not wanting to have an interrogation of things that ought to be interrogated. And in at least 4 instances so far leading up to these elections, we have been faced with that situation. We've had to drag matters out over weeks, sometimes months. Eventually, because the matters in court or for some reason, they've had to fall back on the position articulated by us, and then say that these acts were acts to delay the elections, when the only reason why they had the delay is because they did not immediately rectify things which were brought to their attention. You spoke of the question of this list. Let's assume, as is argued at the level of GCOM by some, that the judge says we can't remove people from the register of registrants and from the voters list. That is not absolutely applicable in local government elections, because the laws in local government elections specifies that people must be ordinarily resident to be on the list, or the voters list, for local government elections. And so those persons will not be taken off of the register of registrants, but certainly cannot be retained on the voters list where they're listed, and that's interesting, where they're listed, because they can be listed somewhere else. They can be listed where they actually reside. But in our process, we have not been sufficiently strict to ensure that such persons are taken off of the list. So we've had a situation, for example, where during the claims and objections process, which we had to struggle to get anyhow, people came forward and said, this person no longer lives here, in one instance. In the next instance, this is my relative, the person is dead. And GCOM says, well, if you don't have a death certificate, the matter is dead. The name remains on the list. So really, we have a situation where GCOM is not honoring the spirit of the law and making a mess sometimes of the letter of the law. And the case in point makes it very clear that that is what is occurring.
I want to ask you, Mr. Alexander, apart from what you know and have experienced at GCOM and the trend at GCOM, what, in your personal view, ought to be the situation now that these revelations have been made, and we have names and we have real people saying, my mother is dead, my father is dead, and you have the General Secretary of the People's Progressive Party, who himself stands accused of very, very high levels of corruption by a news agency, coming to a place in his mind where he can apologize for his party's inclusion of a dead person as a candidate and a dead person as a nominator. Your personal opinion on where this ought to go, how do you see the process being affected were there to be a logical sequence of activities um, and actions
Two
taken?
things. I may well refer to the apology as a prudent apology.
Yeah, well,
We want to refer to the apology as a prudent apology. But beyond that, really the law should take its course. Really the law should take its course. Here are matters which are clearly matters for the police. We've had a situation where there was the amendment of ROPA
yeah,
with the contention that people will be brought before the court if they do anything that's wrong in relation to the electoral system. And here we now have clear instances of wrongdoing. And therefore, the country, the government, the police, and GCOM are all challenged to show their commitment to the rule of law and to show their commitment to things that they have articulated in the past, now that those things have come to pass. We are challenged. And I think this is a test as to whether there's any commitment whatsoever to even the appearance of a just, free, and fair electoral system, to even the appearance. We are at that point of challenge. And if you can't pass that test, then there's no other test, I think, that we can pass. You shouldn't be allowed to sit any other. If you can't pass that simple test, where there are clear criminal matters, where there's been admission, then we are indeed challenged.
all of this action taken by the People's Progressive Party, forging of signatures, inclusion of the dead as candidates, inclusion of the dead as nominators, including persons who are known to be resident abroad as nominators and signatures appearing next to their names and so on, speaks of a party that is desperate to get and to hold on to power for whatever reason. It is almost an overreach of the practices of the People's Progressive Party in government. Take, for example, the couple of hours of rainfall and the flooding of Georgetown a couple of days ago. This is occasioned by a that seeks to dominate the municipality of Georgetown and all other municipalities and local authority areas. In the case of the city of Georgetown, the mayor and city council is being denied their rightful subvention. The Fiscal Transfer Act doesn't work for the city of Georgetown,
Doesn't work for anywhere.
particularly the city of Georgetown. The local government commission overrides um, the municipalities, the local authority areas, particularly Georgetown. They have no authority at the level of the municipality to hire, discipline, or fire employees. The government agencies and ministries are not paying the more than $1 billion that is owed to the mayor and city councilors of Georgetown in rates and taxes. The central government is developing roads, roadways, reducing the width and depth of drainage, drains. Drains are being reduced in size, width and depth. It therefore means that you cannot drain water at the rate you need to. And if drainage is a problem because of locked sluice doors having to do with the high tide outside, you cannot store, you cannot retain water within those drains and canals anymore because they've all been reduced in width and depth. The government seems to be doing everything within its power to damage the image of the mayor and councillors of the city of Georgetown by not doing what is required, by not working with the council, by not listening to advice from the mayor and his technical team. And you have the result that you're seeing on the screen with massive flooding all across the city after 2 or 3 hours of rainfall. This is brutal treatment of citizens by a government. How do you react to what you've been seeing and what you know that is happening in the municipality of
Well, you,
Georgetown in particular?
you've said far more than a mouthful. So much you've said. Let me respond first of all by saying it is clear that our drainage system is not operating at its optimal and probably less than its minimal. Why I say that? If one traverses Georgetown, one would see that even in dry season, we have drainage canals and interlocking drains which are filled with water. In fact, not filled with water, filled with muck. About 75% of the capacity is filled with muck and 25% filled with water. I would contend that if we are to remove the muck from those, the debris from those drains, then immediately Georgetown will have a greater capacity to take off the water when there's heavy rainfall. So the question is, why are we not removing the debris? We are not removing the debris for two reasons. One, we have gotten into a bad culture where the citizens themselves have to take responsibility for the debris in those drains. But that's only one reason. But the other one is the city council does not have the capacity to do its work. I come from Georgetown. I lived in Georgetown where I saw our drains being cleaned almost on a weekly basis. Now, they're not cleaned except for projects that are yearly. So we are part of the problem. The city council does not have the resources to do the work it's supposed to do. And even the resources it's supposed to have, it does not have. Because the government does not pay its taxes and therefore deprives the city council of revenue that's due to it. This is not a matter of favor. You get announcements from this government that they're paying some money as if they're doing a favor, when in fact it's a debt. And by not paying their taxes, they are hamstringing the city council in terms of doing this work. Even in the instance where they give a subvention, they do not give the council the subvention any longer. They have now asked the councillors individually to come up with projects so that there could be a negotiation between the councillors and the minister to determine what happens in Georgetown. So the city council is not able to pursue a program of work based on the revenue it should be getting, which includes the subvention, because the councillors are asked to put into the project. And in fact, that's a recipe for corruption. They are encouraging and corrupting the system by virtue of doing that. So the central government has to take responsibility for the state of Georgetown. And as you correctly said, we have a fiscal transfers bill act that is being observed in the breach. And that act speaks to the way in which uh, money should be transferred to the city based on its population, based on its infrastructure, and based on its own rate of rate collection. That act is not being adhered to. So that basically the the basis on which the council is supposed to be able to do its work is virtually non-existent. But yet it is called upon, and I haven't mentioned people who haven't paid taxes. I haven't mentioned that. And I haven't mentioned the fact that the valuation of properties have not been done, and therefore, as the cost of things go up, the cost of running the council goes up, the value of buildings go up by hundreds of percentages. The city council is left with a tax base that is archaic. It's dysfunctional. And in addition to that, the minister tells the council that they can't raise the rates when the amendments of the local, the municipal and district councils act
Empowers the council so to do.
empowers the council to raise the rates, which could become ridiculous looking rates, but not really ridiculous when you look at the value of the properties.
Yeah.
But they can't raise, he's telling them they can't raise those rates, and they come to this minister and therefore deny themselves the opportunity of increased revenues.
But let's-
So whilst people may want to point to the council as being mismanaging and corrupt and all of that, I would argue that even if we accept mismanagement and corruption, even if we accept that, and even if that did not exist, if we accept it, the revenues available are grossly inadequate for the work the council is supposed to do. I lived in a Georgetown where the cemetery used to have, by record, sometimes as many as 300 sanitation workers.
Yep.
The cemetery now does not have a single sanitation worker. And what happens periodically, they give out contracts. Periodically. And so we have, apparently the Bering Grounds are part of our low carbon policy. So
and some people's voters base.
yes. So we have forestation taking place, so we get credits to low carbon. But none of the credits to low carbon goes to the city council.
But this minister of local government, I cannot understand how any government can condone the behavior of this minister. You violate the law with demarcation of boundaries specific to constituencies for local government election. You overstep your lawful authority. You presiding over local government elections with all these ugly, nasty revelations of blatant acts of fraud and corruption with respect to the list. You preside over your ministry instead of doing your work. This minister, instead of doing his work, seeks to dominate and control the city council, the Georgetown Mayor and City Council, seeks to manipulate by asking for proposals from individual councillors, seek to manipulate councillors, seek to play councillors against each other as they vie for larger sums of money for the projects that they want to do. Another violation, really, of the local government legislations. This is the minister who stood up in Parliament and told a female opposition MP that she wants and should go get a dildo. This is the man who, on social media, features with his private parts being allegedly sent to some young female with whom he was having a conversation, and the lady released all these things, alleging that these images are of this man. You don't hear you do not hear any rebuke coming from the female members of parliament on the government side. You don't hear any rebuke coming from the president or the prime minister or the second vice president with regard to the conduct of this minister. You, this is a minister who was a subject of investigation by police for allegedly drawing a firearm and leveling it against at an employee of an international financial agency in Guyana. The matter being settled out of court, it is no longer a matter of interest for the law enforcement agencies. How does a government which holds itself out to be holier than thou continue to have in its midst a minister behaving in this manner and running one of the larger ministries in the country that touches more lives across this country than any other?
Marvin, first of all, I don't agree with you that one could differentiate between the government and the minister. People are brought together based on commonality of values, sometimes ideology and things like that. And so the values that drive this minister are no different from the values that drive the others, and therefore they're no different from the values that drive the government. So this minister is just a microcosm of the government we are faced with. The issue is not the minister, the issue is the government. He's just a cog in that wheel. And that wheel has that commonality of values that are imposing this functionality on the Guyanese society, imposing this functionality on the administration of public affairs. That's where we're at. We have a government where at the highest level, statements are made. And those statements one cannot take. You know, Vice President Jack Yu said that the country needs trust. Well, I don't know if he's right or he's wrong, but I know that if he wants to deal with the question of trust, he has to start in the house. Because you have got, for example, a president who speaks to me and says to me, by first name Vincent, I will convene the meeting with you. And he says this twice, and he doesn't convene it. Where is this trust that we're talking about?
Sure, there's not an H in that word somewhere.
Where is the trust that we're talking about? So that this is not a Dharamlal matter. Dharamlal is just a face of this matter. It's a matter of the values and the disposition, the ethics that drives the government. And it's all a part of the undemocratic nature of things. Because one element of democracy and the machinery for the realization of democracy is governance. And a sub-element of governance is ethics. Apart from accountability, apart from transparency and all of that, ethics is one of the sub-elements of governance. And if you don't get the ethics right, then you don't get the governance right. If you don't get the governance right, then you can't get the democracy right.
Why would a political party invest money and human resources in perpetrating fraud at the base level of an electoral process in its quest to dominate local government areas within the country, only to destroy those local authority
I don't think this
areas?
government believes in local government. the behavior this government suggests that if they had a chance, they would not embrace local government. They only embrace local government because it's a sexy thing to say. But what they do does not suggest they're constant, they have not allowed the growth and development of local government. Their intervention all the time stymies any possibility of the growth and development. They're not committed to local government. And you know, it's interesting. I happen to have done work on local government here and across the region. And without calling the name of a particular prime minister who's close to this government, I think about 10 to 15 years ago, we were wrapping up a project across the region. And you were meeting with the prime minister whose country had just done a consultation on local government reform. And what that prime minister told us? That prime minister told us that in his country, he would never fathom or allow local government to be controlled by a party other than his own. He said that. I'm not talking third hand or fourth hand. I was in the meeting as one of the consultants, and he told us that. Very good friend of this government. It is the belief, the ideology that drives this behavior that we are witnessing. But because of the emergent international values
and expectations,
and expectations, and the fact that if you don't try to seem to be in line, then action is taken against you. They have to articulate a commitment, but the articulation is far distant from the actualization.
There's an irony here. The government gives the outward impression that its embrace of local government election is its embrace of local democracy. But while preparing for local government elections, what could be viewed as deliberate acts outside of the law by the minister are the acts that were responsible for the delay in this process. Behavior of the political party that forms the government, particularly with fraud related to the list and nominations and so on, potentially can derail this electoral process, local government 2023. But here, while they give that outward impression, the People's Progressive Party is destroying every tenet of local democracy imaginable. The entire raft of legislation that govern local government in this country are either being ignored or not complied with at all for whatever other reason. Voter rights are suppressed by these fraudulent acts. What is the game that the PPP is playing?
You're a kind guy. You're a kind guy. How could you say that they have this outer impression of a commitment to local government when the head of state goes to a village and tells the people, I'm not dealing with your elected representatives? What outer impression is that?
No, I'm talking about holding the election. I'm not talking about the consequences of the election.
Holding the election.
Holding the election. That's specifically what I'm talking about.
Well, as I said before, this question of holding the election has to do with apparently meeting the international best practices and standards in terms of democracy and decentralization. And they want to tick the box. They want to tick the box. But at the same time, you see the maneuvers that, on one hand, undermine the holding of the elections, but on the other hand, if the elections are held, 6 of one, half a dozen the other, because the institutions are not allowed to function the way they should be functioned. So hold the elections. What's the problem with that? You hold them and you say you tick the box. You've held elections, therefore you've met a requirement of democracy. And then the real requirements of democracy, that elections should create the machinery to facilitate are not facilitated. So that basically one has to see what are the motives behind these behavioral patterns.
Would you say that local democracy in Guyana is dying a slow death, or would you say that local democracy in Guyana is virtually dead under the People's Progressive Party?
Local democracy in Guyana under the People's Progressive Party does not show any growth and development. It is largely stagnated, as well as there's a fair amount of regression in the system of local democracy. There's regression because one thing we haven't talked about, even the people who are being elected don't understand and not committed to local democracy. I remember when we reintroduced local government in 1994, when it was reintroduced. I went to Blackbush Polder. And by 3 months after the elections, the councillors had all resigned. I said, this is not what they thought it is. And that has repeated itself in subsequent elections, where people become councillors, they don't understand, they're not committed, and for many of them, it's just another hustle.
Mr. Vincent Alexander, Commissioner, Guyana Elections Commission, here on Nation Watch today, Sunday, April 23rd, 2023. Giving his perspective on this business of local democracy in Guyana, do you, viewers, believe that local democracy is dying a slow death? Do you believe that local democracy is near dead? Do you believe that local democracy is dead under the People's Progressive Party? Think on it. Let's know what you think in the comments. Have a blessed rest of this beautiful Sunday. Until we meet again, hopefully tomorrow afternoon at 7 to discuss those other issues we talked about. Have a pleasant rest of Sunday. God bless.
You just living from pay to paycheck. When I get to get paid, cost of living high, the pressure high, getting worse every day. When the man call you for something, you just know it's another bill. You want end yourself, but you can't take it and have nothing inside your will. Well, every day you feel you want chuck it, cause it seems you don't have no luck. You got families, plenty friends, but nobody don't give up. Well, everybody go through the struggle. Some people get worse than you. We have some people existing and they don't have a clue. You can't do this thing without faith. Trusting God and you will be great. Nothing about the way. You've been young and I can't relate.